Okay, I guess they want me to start, so we'll start.
That's for you.
Good morning, and thank you for showing up. My name is Evan Weiner, and this is I speak on cruises. Can you hear me without the microphone?
Yes.
Okay, okay. This is a cruise ship talk. My daughter actually lives in Seattle, but I have to do these talks on cruise ships.
They can't hear you without the
Okay,
microphone.
that's fine. Anyway, can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'm on cruise ships and I'm in the Pacific Northwest. I haven't done a cruise ship since COVID-19, so it's been 3 years, literally 3 years this month, since I was in San Francisco on a cruise ship. Anyway, the Pacific Northwest, how much do you know about the Pacific Northwest?
Go.
No, yeah, you don't know about the Oregon Territory and about restrictions in the Oregon Territory and how the Trump family made its money in Victoria, British Columbia during the Klondike Gold Rush, among other things. Anyway, that's Seattle. That's the view from my daughter's apartment in Seattle. This is Victoria with my wife there in Victoria, British Columbia. Vancouver, that's the Lionsgate Bridge. Now you might have heard of a company called Lionsgate that produces movies. Well, they named their company after that bridge. Seattle. Seattle was a boom or bust town. It was built on the Gold Rush, 1896 to 1899. Victoria, British Columbia. They were aided by the opium trade. They were built on the opium trade and the gold rush. And Vancouver's growth began with another gold rush in 1858. 25,000 men came there, mostly from California to Westminster, New Westminster, on the Fraser River. Before Seattle, it was the home of Native Americans for about 4,000 years. A guy by the name of George Vancouver was the first explorer who quote-unquote discovered Seattle in May of 1972. He was going through the Pacific Northwest. 2 cities were named after him: Vancouver, Washington, and Vancouver, British Columbia. The area became part of the Oregon Territory. How many of you remember from your days in American history with James K. Polk as the President of the United States this phrase, 54-40 or fight, right? Well, this is actually in Alaska. But that was part of the 54-40 or fight. This is near the Hubbard Glacier up in Alaska. In 1818, the United States and Great Britain both said, hey, Oregon Territory, that's us. It's the region west of the Rocky Mountains between 42 degrees north, the northern boundary of California, and 5440, which was the southern boundary of Russia's Alaska Territory. 5440 or fight by the 1840s, joint control of the territories by the British and by the Americans had broken down. And the presidential candidate, James K. Polk, claimed, it's our territory. What are you going to do about it? But there was a problem. There was a big problem. It was called Mexico. And there was going to be a Mexican war on the southern border. And that becomes a big problem because you can't have fights on both edges of the border. Anyway, 5440, that was the slogan, and it became the rallying cries of settlers into the territory. It was picked up from a guy from Ohio, the Senator William Allen, who said it on the floor of the Senate in 1844. The dispute, though, would be settled by 1846. And the Americans got control of the Oregon Territory. Know anything about the Oregon Territory? You don't know anything about it. Well, that's kind of interesting. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 partially set up a border between the United States and Britain, Canada. But the Oregon Territory border was unsettled. 1844. All black people were ordered to get out of the Oregon Territory. And that extended from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast. Those who would not leave could be severely whipped. The provisional government law declared by not less than 20 or more than 39 stripes to be repeated every 6 months until they left. Fortunately, no black or anybody was ever lashed. That is the Columbia River. That's where Lewis and Clark discovered the Pacific Northwest. The Oregon Territory existed between August 14th, 1848, and it ends on February 14th, 1859. That's when the Southwest... You had a question? I saw somebody saying. Okay, that's when the southwestern portion of the territory becomes the state of Oregon. And since the Oregon Territory is gone, that would create the Washington Territory. The region had been divided by the UK and the US in 1846. The American area would include Oregon, Washington, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, Montana. This was a very big territory. The British part would include British Columbia and Alberta. Hey, did you ever hear of the Pig War of 1859? No. Do you think that the final war between the Brits and the Americans was the War of 1812? Is that what you learned? Because that's what you learned. Well, not quite the case. Behind there is the San Juan Islands that my wife is standing in front of. The wording of the Oregon Territory Treaty was vague when it came to the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island. There are several navigable waterways between Vancouver Island and the mainland, and the ownership of the San Juan Islands was contested. Well, in 1859, this pig wandered from the British-Canadian side to the American side and was found in an American settler's garden. They shot the pig. And the Brits got really mad because they shot the pig. And they wanted compensation for this pig that was shot. American troops were sent to occupy the island. The British warships patrolled offshore. The dispute was finally settled in 1872. So you've never heard of the Pig War. There was such a thing as the Pig War. And it was fought for 13 years, all while the Civil War was taking place. Before Seattle, 1851, how many of you been to Seattle? There's no real, they laid out Seattle, you got Denny Way here, you got another road here, you got another road. They never really came up with a comprehensive plan to lay out a city. Part of it is because of disputes on land, and part of it is because of the topography. Anyway, this guy by the name of Luther Collins had a party. And they go up the river. They formally claim the land on September 14th, 1851. 13 days later, the members of the Collins Party passed 3 scouts of the Denny Party. The member of the Denny Party, they decided Elkie Point is our land, which is why Seattle looks like it does today. And they did it on September 28, 1851. So that is Seattle behind me on the cruise ship. We know that Native Americans were there at least 4,000 years. Arthur A. Denny and the Denny Party arrived from Illinois through Portland, Oregon on a schooner, and they were there November 13, 1851. The settlement then would move to the east shore of Elliott Bay. They named it Seattle after a local Indian tribe, and there is Seattle at night from my daughter's apartment. Logging was the first major industry that Seattle had in the late 19th century, and it became a commercial and shipbuilding center. It was the gateway to Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush. Pioneer Square is where Seattle was started, but there was a great fire. This is one thing you're going to learn about the Pacific Northwest. These places were burnt down. They weren't built well. There was the Great Seattle Fire, 1889. By the end of 1890, dozens of bricks and stone buildings had been erected in their stead. In the 1960s, Pioneer Square became a target of urban renewal, and they said, let's get rid of all the old buildings. And we'll have parking garages in downtown Seattle. Another proposal was to ring a road, which would have destroyed many of Pioneer Square's buildings. Finally, in 1970, those buildings were listed on the National Register of Historical Places. There is one of the coolest places you could go if you like garbage in Seattle, is the Seattle Underground. Somebody decided, hey, let's preserve the history of Seattle. How are we going to do that? Well, there's a lot of garbage. So why don't we salvage the garbage in these old buildings like this? When do you think the last time that couch was cleaned? What do you think? Probably, what, about 1958, 1959?
That was close.
Yeah, probably. The Seattle Underground is a network of underground passages and basements in the Pioneer Square area. They are located at ground level where the city was built in the mid-19th century, but they fell into disuse after the streets were elevated. In recent decades, they become a tourist attraction, guided tours taking place around the area. I spent about $15 looking at garbage. $45 when you include my daughter and my wife. Here's the fire. Fire was accidental, but it basically burned Seattle down to the ground. Destroyed the entire business district. That was June 6, 1889. 25 blocks of buildings gone. $20 million worth of damage. Multiply that by about 30 now, you got $600 million worth of damage. Streets in the Pioneer Square area were then elevated 22 feet above the pre-fire street level, and new buildings made of wood were banned. In 1852, Henry Yesler, another guy, that's why Seattle was claimed by a whole bunch of people, began the construction of the first steel-powered mill in the Pacific Northwest because of easy access to lumber. If you've ever gone on Route 5 going north toward Vancouver, all you see are forests. That's all you see. Or going south from Vancouver to Seattle. So there's easy access to lumber, every building constructed of affordable, but you can't stop timber if it catches fire. And here is the fire. Seattle was at or below sea level. It was hit by massive floods. The topography is not good. So the buildings are on wooden stilts. The town was also hollowed out from scrap logs and put up on wooden braces as sewers and water pipes, increasing above the sewer and water pipes, increasing the chance of a big fire. On June 6, 1889, John Back is working in a woodworking shop at the corner of Front Street, now First Avenue, and was heating glue over a gasoline fire. Think of that, heating glue over a gasoline fire in a wooden building, right? And there's the fire. This is a colorized picture of the fire. Sometime after 2 o'clock, the glue boiled over, caught fire, spread to the floors, which were covered by wood chips and turpentine. Yeah, he tried to put out the fire with water, but that only thinned the turpentine and spread the fire further. Seattle's water supply was provided by a privately owned company. Fire hydrants were located on every other street. The pipes were small, they were from logs, and they would burn in the fire. And the fire would literally burn down the city. More hoses are coming to add to the fire. The water pressure falls. The hoses stop working. Firemen tried to keep the fire from spreading by pumping water from Elliott Bay onto the commercial mill, but the tide was out. So everything's going against them. And the hoses aren't long enough to reach the side of the building closest to fire. And then the wind started to pick up. By 4 o'clock, 2 hours later, 4 o'clock, everybody realized it's gone, it's over. Fire would burn for about 13 hours. Thousands of people displaced, 5,000 men lost their jobs. The city estimated losses of more than $8 million, and that doesn't include human losses on the water and electric services, and the total losses could have been as much as $20 million. But they decided to rebuild, and they're going to rebuild in the same place, but it's not going to be wooden buildings anymore. And also, the street levels were raised to 22 feet so you wouldn't have flooding. Within a year, 465 buildings had been built, and Seattle was back in business. Brick buildings were built. And Seattle decided, you know what? We can't have any more volunteer firemen. We're going to have paid firemen, paid firehouses, we're going to have a chief, and we're going to have an ordinance which requires a certain amount of thickness for the walls. Oh, by the way, so this is not part of the underground. This is a museum in Seattle. And strike it rich. Strike it rich. But how do you get to the Klondike? Well, you get to the Klondike by Winnipeg, or you get to the Klondike by Seattle. And this becomes the boom times for Seattle. The panic of 1893, which there was a depression, began with the panic of 1893, then a depression, and then the boom, the gold rush. And Seattle becomes a major, major city. Hey, there's gold in them there hills. All you have to do is go up to the Klondike. On July 14, 1897, the SS Portland docked with its famed ton of gold, and Seattle became the main transport and supply point for miners in Alaska and the Yukon. Seattle is back. The boom would last into the early part of the 20th century, and it would fund a whole bunch of companies, included in 1917, this 19-year-old guy by the name of James E. Casey borrows $100 from a friend, which at that point was about $2,500, and he would be the founder of the American Messenger Company, which you today know as UPS. UPS started there. This was the tallest building on the West Coast, the Smith Building. It was built in 1914. Other Seattle companies found during this era. How many of you shopped at Nordstrom's? That started there. Eddie Bauer. That started there. Seattle brought in the Olmsted brothers to do landscaping, and they designed parks and boulevards. The Yukon, Alaska, or the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909 took place there. It's kind of a World's Fair. And the gold rush would end in 1909. And today, that land is the layout for the University of Washington campus, which is down the road from my daughter. Seattle was okay in the 1920s, but the Depression hits in 1929. And there were a lot of problems after 1929. There was violence during the maritime strike in 1934, and Seattle would lose much of its maritime traffic. It went to the port of Los Angeles. Los Angeles was just a sleepy town in 1934. It happened to have Hollywood and little else. But all of a sudden, the port of Los Angeles picks up all of this business that went to Seattle. But World War II was a good thing. Not that World War II and the Holocaust is ever a good thing, right? But it was a good thing for Seattle because Boeing was there. And that's where a lot of planes were built for the war. But they did not keep up, Seattle, with the rest of the country after the war because there wasn't the need for as many planes. And but Boeing, the jet age, would again be a big supplier, big employer in the Seattle area because of the jet engine. And so that was good until the 1950s, or in the 1950s, and there was Boeing. But again, another boom and bust. Late 1960s, early 70s, Boeing is affected by the oil crisis, loss of government contracts, delays associated with the Boeing 747. People picked up, left, said, well, we got to find work somewhere. It's not going to be here. Two local real estate agents put up a billboard reading, will the last person leaving Seattle please turn off the lights? Anybody been to this area in Seattle? My daughter lives 6 blocks away from there. 1962 Seattle World's Fair. You mean you didn't see the Elvis movie? It happened at the fair? No Elvis fans in here? Thank you very much. The Seattle 25th 21 exposition was also called the Seattle World's Fair. It was from April 21st to October 21st, 1962. Oh, some of the innovations that you saw at the 1962 World's Fair, besides Elvis's movie, it happened at the fair. Cordless phones were introduced, and you got your first cordless phone, or got to see your first cordless phone there. The fair was also the site of some of the first satellite transmissions of telephone calls and television broadcasts. And today it's a Seattle landmark. That's a hill up the street from where my daughter lives, and you can see the entire downtown. 1962, it did not look like that. There are cranes all over the place. Amazon's got a building over there, and well, a lot of the companies are up in Seattle. The U.S. government was interested in showing off the nation. You gotta remember, we're in the middle of the Cold War, right? 1962. How many of you remember fallout shelters? Oh yeah, how many of you were like this, like me? Under a desk.
Duck and cover.
Yeah, duck and cover, right? Duck and cover. Tell kids about duck and cover today. What? Is that some kind of food? My first grade teacher, Mrs. Toper, got mad at me. I said, why am I going under a desk? If they're going to kill me, I might as well be standing up. Oh, you get under the desk and don't ask questions.
That'll save you.
Yeah, that'll save me,
So now
right?
they have shooting drills.
Yeah, yeah. So they commit $9 million to the fair to build the NASA-themed United States Science exhibit. Now it's the Pacific Science Center. And 35 governments basically signed on to be exhibitors. I see a fair sign back there. It says Robert Moses in the World's Fair, 1964. How many of you were at the 1964 New York World's Fair? Do you know that was not an official World's Fair? It was not an official World's Fair. Do you know that? Now, Moses was denied because of the Seattle World's Fair in 62 and the planned Montreal World's Fair in 67. He said, we're not going to give you World's Fair designation. Moses didn't care. It was the New York World's Fair, whether the International World's Fair Committee liked it or not. And the monorail. The monorail, I've been up in Seattle because my daughter, as I said, my daughter lives there. I've never been on the monorail. The monorail was supposed to go around Seattle, but it kind of stops from the Space Needle, or starts at Space Needle, or stops at Space Needle, and just goes to the middle of the downtown. It was built for the 1962 World's Fair, and it was supposed to link the fairgrounds and downtown. The construction of that started in 1961, but was never completed. Along with the Space Needle, the Seattle Center monorail is considered a local iconic landmark. Oh, you know who some of the musicians went here? Because Seattle's known for music, especially grunge music in the 1990s. Hey, there's Ray Charles, Quincy Jones. By the way, Quincy Jones, being that we're in Tenafly, do you know who one of his most famous proteges was? Leslie Gore.
Yeah, we lived in Tina.
Tenafly. Tenafly. I know her mother, Ronnie. She lived in Tenafly. She said that Q used to be at the house all the time. Her mother is 99 years old. Still going strong. Between 1918 and 1951, there were 24 jazz clubs along Jackson Street, running from Chinatown, the International District, to the Central District. The early careers of Ray Charles, Quincy Jones, Bumps Blackwell, Ernestine Anderson, and others, that scene developed their careers. The Brothers Four vocal group, the Fleetwoods, the 1960 Garage Rockers, the Wailers, the Sonics, and the instrumental surf group, the Ventures, all came from Seattle. And also in the 1990s, there was Nirvana, although this crowd probably wasn't into Nirvana, were you? Probably not. Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Mudhoney, they reached international audiences in the early 1990s, and that is Nirvana and Kurt Cobain, who passed away a long time ago. Seattle, well, you know, that was the big thing in the 1990s, grunge bands. How many of you remember this guy? Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix, right? Well, it's a Jimi Hendrix exhibit up in Seattle. And yeah, cool guy, Jimi Hendrix, right? He was born in Seattle, November 27th, 1942. And his influences included B.B. King, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Buddy Holly.
One of my favorites.
Which one?
Buddy Holly.
Buddy Holly. I know. I knew Dave Somerville, who toured with Buddy Holly. Wasn't on that last tour, but part of my early days of rock and roll talk, I did an interview with Dave, and I used it for that. You know, Buddy Holly only was on that tour to make money. He wanted to change direction at that time, but he made a lot of money on the tour. That's why he rented out the plane, and the rest is history. You know, the day the music died, Buddy Holly. Jimi Hendrix couldn't read music, so made him concentrate on the music. There was also a baseball team called the Seattle Pilots. So many baseball fans are here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very bad team.
a very bad team. Very bad team. But that's Jim Bouton.
Oh yeah.
That's Jim Bouton, who is a friend of mine. And that's the Yogi Berra Museum, as a matter of fact. And Jim Bouton wrote the quintessential baseball book about the Seattle Pilots and Houston Astros in 1969 called Ball 4, which lifted the veil on the personal lives of Mickey Mantle, who drank, among others. Seattle was given an expansion team by baseball in 1968. They lasted 1 year. They went bankrupt, moved to Milwaukee in 1970. And what's remembered about the Pilots team is the book Ball 4. And by the way, there is a Home Depot in Seattle that, in the middle of the parking lot, marks the spot of the home plate of Sick Stadium where that team played. And whatever becomes of sports relics, well, the Kingdome is gone, and that is a championship trophy from the Seattle Supersonics basketball team. Sits in the Seattle Museum. The team moved to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma in 2008. Seattle could be a sports town because listen to some of the companies there. Amazon, Starbucks, Nordstrom's, Expediers, International of Washington. Costco, how many of you have Costco memberships? Costco is there. Microsoft is there. Weyerhaeuser, the forest products company, is in Federal Way. Bellevue is the home to the truck manufacturer, Packer. Other companies include, how many of your kids and grandkids played video games? Video. You mean your grandkids or your kids never played video games? When they came out 35, 40 years ago, like Nintendo, T-Mobile. It's not working right now, T-Mobile. I gotta see why that's the problem. They're in Bellevue, Expedia, Providence Health and Services, and they're in Renton. But they have trouble with sports teams. The Pilots left. King County sued Major League Baseball. The Kingdome was built to house a baseball and football team. The NFL got there in 1976. And Major League Baseball settled this Pilots case by giving them a team in 1977. And the problematic World's Fair Arena, the Key Arena, has been rebuilt, and that's now the home of National Hockey League team. The Seattle Seahawks football team nearly moved to Anaheim. The baseball team saved by Nintendo and their president Hiroshima Yamauchi back in 1992. But there was a bunch of xenophobia. Major League Baseball didn't want a Japanese man owning a baseball team. So I said, yeah, you can own the baseball team, but Americans like John Ellis better run the baseball team. And that's what happened. They didn't want foreign ownership, and the National Hockey League finally put the team there last year. It's a gateway to Asia. The Port of Seattle, which operates this SeaTac International Airport, is a major gateway for trade with Asia and cruises to Alaska. It's the 8th largest port in the United States in terms of container capacity. Now, this probably means nothing to you, right? It's a sign. It's a pink elephant. It's a pink elephant. It's a car wash. Yet, in Seattle, That is a major landmark. Now, if you saw a pink elephant car wash sign outside here on 9W, what would you think?
Nuts.
Yeah, that is a major landmark in Seattle. And the public market in Seattle is obviously a big deal. It's Pike Place. It opened on August 17th, 1907. It is one of the oldest continually operated public farmers markets in the United States. And guess what? Let's get rid of it, right? Why keep it? Let's get rid of it. So we'll get rid of it in 1963, and we'll replace it with a hotel and apartment building, and 4 office buildings, and a hockey arena, and a parking garage. But people said, no. You're not messing with Pike Market. You're not messing with it at all. And it's still there. There it is, and they have the fish there, and you can say, I want that live fish, that live fish. They'll pull it out, knock off the head, and it's yours to eat at Pike's Market. Initiative was passed on November 2nd, 1971. It created a historic zone, and it's owned by the city. By the way, the first Starbucks across the street from there in 1971. Foggy morning, can't see the top of the tower. Starbucks? I'm a censor there. You know why I'm a censor? Because the mermaid's nude. She's topless. The original Starbucks logo had a topless mermaid. It started in Seattle in 1971. So we go up a little bit to Victoria, British Columbia. Canadians talk about Victoria. Anybody been to Victoria? Is it nice? It's really nice. You should go to the Empress Hotel for tea at 4 o'clock.
They have nice flowers.
Yeah, tea at 4 o'clock. Anyway, if you talk to a Canadian about Victoria, they'll tell you, the newlywed and the nearly dead live there. The British agent James Douglas and his men came upon the shores searching for the Pacific coast, or searching the Pacific coast for the new Hudson Bay Company headquarters, and they were welcomed by the First Nations there, and they said, hey, set up a post, do a trading post in 1842. And there is still some trade that goes on in Victoria. It was named for Queen Victoria. The city is the oldest in the Pacific Northwest. It is the oldest in the Pacific Northwest on the Canadian side, beginning as a British settlement in 1843. And that is downtown Victoria, the inner harbor. The gold was discovered in the Fraser River in 1858. Miners came from all around the world to Victoria, which was a seaport. And they got the goods they needed for the mainland gold fields. Economic activity shifted from trade to business. Fort Victoria became a rich, populous city with a dwindling First Nations population. And there is Victoria by the sea at night. 1866, Vancouver Island and British Columbia united to form a single colony. 2 years later, the city of Victoria was declared as the capital. But America surrounded the British colonial territory. The northwest border was now Alaska. South of the 49th parallel was the U.S. territories. Canada starts in the east. So what do we do? What do we do in 1871? Do we become a part of America? After all, we're building a wall to keep the drunken Americans from Washington out of British Columbia. Yeah, they were thinking of building a wall to keep the Americans out. In 1867, there were 3 options. Stay a British colony, be annexed by the United States, or confederate with Eastern Canada, which was Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Quebec and Ontario. In Britain, there were some who said, leave. Just leave. Get out of it. Because you're too expensive. Go to the Americans. It's okay. Go to the Americans. Well, the Americans wanted British Columbia, and they were suing the Brits because of things that happened during the Civil War. I don't know if you ever heard of the Alabama claims, have you? Yeah. Alabama claims. Series of demands for damages sought by the government of the United States from the United Kingdom. 1869. Because of attacks on Union merchant ships by the Confederate Navy. They were in ships built by the Brits in British shipyards during the Civil War. That is British Columbia. That's right outside of Vancouver. Looks nice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That looks nice. Actually, it's a valley, and you go 2,000 feet to the top of those hills. William Seward. Remember Seward's Folly, Alaska? Anybody here go to Seward High School in Lower Manhattan?
Yeah, Lower East Side.
Lower East Side. And who's the most famous alum of Seward High School?
Robinson?
Maybe. Guy named Bernie Schwartz. You don't know who Bernie Schwartz is? Tony Curtis. He is the most famous alum of Seward High School, right? And they redid Seward High School, and you wouldn't recognize the neighborhood today. Anyway, so Seward, as the American Secretary of State, said, we get British Columbia, we get Alaska, then we get British Columbia, and we are in total control of the Pacific coast. And he thought that in British Columbia, yeah, we'll go to the Americans, except I told you they tried to put up the wall because they didn't like the drunks. So he said to Britain, hey, we'll drop the claims, just give us British Columbia. And there is BC, and that's a building from roughly that time in BC. London wasn't too sure, but American commercial and financial groups said, settle this thing, we want the money. And there was a growing Canadian nationalism in British Columbia and staying inside the British Empire. And then Congress got bogged down with Reconstruction, and Americans had no interest in territorial expansion, at least to British Columbia. So there's an alliance with the United States now, the border there. And you talk to the people in the Pacific Northwest, there's no difference between the Washingtonians and the British Columbians. 1869, Seward visited Victoria, proposing an economic alliance between Alaska, BC, Washington, Oregon, and California. But BC was looking for something else. They were looking for something that Seward couldn't give them. A railroad linking them to the east. And that is where things change. A delegation from BC is sent to Ottawa, capital, which used to be a bawdy town. You know why Ottawa is the capital of Canada? Because there are 41 miles of swamp between New York and the St. Lawrence Seaway and Ottawa. And they figured, putting the capital in Ottawa, that no American army would go through 40 miles of swamp and risk getting malaria. That's why Ottawa is the capital of Canada. Anyway, the demands called for a responsible provincial government, economic aid, debt conception, and the construction of a major transportation link. The railroad would eventually come, and BC would join the Canadians, not the Americans, in 1871. In 1871, British Columbia became the 6th province of the Dominion of Canada, ahead of Prince Edward Island, which was trying to become part of America. During the late 1800s and the early 1900s, Victoria became the busiest seaport north of San Francisco. It's the Empress Hotel. Anybody want to go for tea at 4 o'clock? Every day, 4 o'clock, time for tea at the Empress Hotel. The current Parliament buildings were constructed there, 1893 to 1897, the city's inner harbor. The Canadian Pacific Railroad's Grand Empress Hotel was built in 1908. There's a Royal BC Museum nearby, and the inner harbor has become the city's symbolic center. And here is Chinatown. Chinese played a major role in building that railroad, and that's Chinatown downtown. A few wealthy Chinese merchants from San Francisco came to Victoria by boat in June 1858. They bought properties, they built wooden huts in preparation for their laborers, recruited for panning oil in the Fraser River. Hong Kong was also the largest exporter of raw and refined opium in North America. And a lot of it ended up in Victoria, San Francisco, Vancouver, and Tacoma. The refined opium was sold as is. The raw opium was processed in factories in Canada or the United States. Opium was common and was a legal import from China. Up until 1865, it was largely unregulated on Victoria Island. And there's another picture of the inner island. Victoria, major port city, lively town, visitors from all over the world. And it was also a British colony, or British Confederate, through Canada, which meant Hong Kong, a British colony, could trade in Victoria. And they traded opium legally. In 1880, the United States and China came to an agreement that prohibited opium import into the other country. Chinese opium merchants in the U.S. could no longer import opium directly from China, but they could rely on supplies coming from Victoria. And there is a painting from the old days of the turn of the century. Smuggling opium was common because the duty on opium was $5 a pound in Canada, $10 a pound in the U.S. The Canadian government was aware of the smuggling problem, but didn't bother because the trade helped promote opium manufacturing and generated revenue for the government. Exactly how well Canadian governments profited from the opium industry between 1860 and 1908 is unknown. As much as smoking opium produced here was smuggled into the United States after production. After a 1908 report exposed the extent to which opium was imported and taxed in Canada and destined for re-export in the United States, the government said, that's it, it's over. No more manufacturing of smoking opium. Oh, by the way, this building here, right in the middle, right there, was that Frederick Trump's or Drump's brothel in Victoria? It was. It was. It is well known that Donald Trump's grandfather, Frederick Trump, had brothels in British Columbia during the Klondike Gold Rush at the turn of the 20th century. Locals will tell you that Frederick Trump operated a brothel in Victoria as well. Donald Trump has denied his grandfather ran brothels in British Columbia, but it's well known who was running the brothels. So you just go hang out. There are the flowers in Victoria. It is the commercial center of, it was the commercial center of British Columbia, but it was lost to the city of Vancouver. The city then said, hey, look, we're genteel, we're civil here, we got this natural setting, and Rudyard Kipling was there, and he was impressed by the opening of the local gardens in 1904. It's also a retirement community because the weather is good. Most of Canada's weather in the winter is extremely harsh. It's not harsh in Victoria or Vancouver because it gets down to 42. Never really gets above 75 in Victoria, so it's actually a nice community. But it's got a disproportionately large retirement community. 6.84% of the population is over the age of 80. It's the third highest concentration of people 65 and over, only in Canada, behind Peterborough, Ontario, and Kelowna, British Columbia, which isn't that far away. Oh, and they also, like Queen Elizabeth, like a lot of other places in Canada, there are all kinds of statues of Liz, and there's one in the middle of Victoria. It is British Columbia after all, right? So, hey, there are all the symbols of the provinces and territories in Canada. So it's on to Vancouver, and you can take a ferry. And if you take a ferry, that's what you see, onto Vancouver. Vancouver, Fort Vancouver, was the 19th century fur trading post that was the headquarters of the Hudson Bay Company's Columbia Department, located in the Pacific Northwest. But it wasn't there. It was outside of Portland, Oregon. Named for Captain George Vancouver, the fort was on the northern bank of the Columbia River in present-day Vancouver, Washington. Vancouver, Washington was one of the world's intellectual capitals at one point. So what happened? The fort was a major center of regional fur trade. Every year, trade goods and supplies from London arrived there from ships sailing the Pacific Ocean or overland from the Hudson Bay via the York Factory Express. At its pinnacle, Fort Vancouver watched 34 outposts, 24 ports, 6 ships, 600 employees. That's looking east from Vancouver, British Columbia. The Oregon Treaty set the Canadian-United States border, and Fort Vancouver was in America. And the Hudson Bay Company said, we can't operate in America, we're not an American company. They became unprofitable, they left. Fort Vancouver was totally abandoned. The New Vancouver, that is the New Vancouver, which was growing exponentially until they ran out of spots. Now Nova Scotia is growing in Halifax. The population density is 18,837 residents per kilometer. Vancouver is the densest city center of all the downtowns in Canada. There are 662,248 people who live in Vancouver, up from 631,486. There was a population of 2.6 million people. It's the third largest metropolitan area in Canada. That is a Vancouver sunrise. Not bad, huh? Vancouver sunrise. It's a diverse city. 52% of its residents are not native English speakers. 48% speak neither English or French. 50.6% of the residents are part of minority groups, and it's one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in. It is the most expensive city in Canada. Only San Francisco on the west coast is more expensive. Modern city overlooking the port. It's one of the youngest cities in British Columbia, not settled until 1862. There was a sawmill established in Moodyville, now North Vancouver, in 1863, which started logging. But again, it's the train. The train is a big deal that links it to Eastern Canada. By 1887, the Continental Railroad was extended into the city. It soon became a vital link in the trade route between Asia, East Canada, and Europe. It's the third largest port in the Americas, 27th largest port in the world, third busiest and largest port in Canada. It was incorporated on April 6, 1886, named after the explorer George Vancouver. And of course, there's a fire, right? Because you can't have a Pacific Coast city without a fire ruining the city. And that happened June 13th, 1886. The whole city burns down. The fire department is established that year. The city is quickly rebuilt. Grows from a settlement of 1,000 in 1881, 20,000 by the turn of the century, 100,000 by 1911. That is Canada, right? Hey, Stanley Park may be the nicest park in North America. Anybody been to Stanley Park? Queen Elizabeth Park is really good. There are mountains, there's ocean, there's forests, there's parklands. About 1 million people come through Vancouver just on cruise ships alone every year. Prospect Point, actually I burned down that area. So Prospect Point look at that view of Prospect Point, it's gorgeous. Oh, feminism. Feminism. Vancouver. You would never think that it would be a place where women's rights would grow, right? But it did. There was feminist activity in Vancouver in the 19th and 20th century, focused on legal rights, such as having women, or giving women the right to vote. 1880, British Columbia, 51% of the high school graduates were women. And it continued to be that way into 1950. This is Mary Ellen Smith. She's a rather interesting character. She was an activist, member of the Suffrage League of Canada. Her husband, Ralph Smith, died in February 1917, and she ran to succeed him as a member of the Legislative Assembly in Vancouver in January 1918 by election. She ran as an independent liberal. Her slogan, "Women and children first." Women and children first. And she was elected by a wide margin, first woman in the BC legislature. And she introduced the Minimum Wage Act of 1918 and established the minimum wage for women of $12.77 a week. Now, I'm not sure how you can, what the Canadian dollar, if you extend it out, but figure about 20%, 20 times, at least 20 times. So that would be what, about $320 a week. She also helped enact laws establishing juvenile courts, allowing women to serve as judges, and she passed laws protecting women in the workplace. Where was America in the 19-teens? Women were still fighting for the right to vote. And here she is. She passed the Mother's Pension Act in 1924. Social Security did not pass until the mid-30s in the U.S. Later renamed the Mother's Allowance Act. The act provided divorced, deserted, or widowed wives with guaranteed monthly incomes to raise children under the age of 16. But she supported an anti-Asian policy, and she was a eugenicist. But there's also the Women and Girls Protection Act of 1923, which restricted their employment by Asians. She also advocated for the sterilization of the feeble-minded because she didn't want them to reproduce because of race suicide. She accepted the racial science of her day that justified legislation efforts to protect her own Anglo-Canadian race. Prohibition. There's no prohibition in Canada. The alcohol prohibition lasted in Canada October 1st, 1917 till 1921, and then there were changes. As part of the successful 1916 election platform, the Provisional Liberty Party promoted prohibition, Liberal Party, prohibition in women's suffrage. The election ballot included referendums on both issues. Both were improved. Internment camps. They came to Canada before they came to the United States, partly because Canada was involved in World War I since September, or World War II rather, since September 1st, 1939. But shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor in the United States, in Honolulu, Hawaiian territory, Japanese Canadians were stripped of their homes and businesses, then sent to internment camps in farms in British Columbia, as well as other parts of Canada. That would last until 1949. The internment in Canada included the theft and seizure and sale of properties belonging to this forcefully displaced population, which included fishing boats, motor vehicles, houses, farms, businesses, and personal belongings. Japanese Canadians were forced to use the proceeds of the forced sales to pay for their basic needs during internment. The United States would quickly follow. And here is a picture of Canadian internment camps and farms. In August 1944, the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, was part of the Quebec Conference in 1943 with Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, where they were formulating plans for D-Day. Announced that Japanese Canadians would be moved further east out of the British Columbia interior. The official policy stated that Japanese Canadians must move east to the Rocky Mountains or be deported to Japan following the war. By 1947, many Japanese Canadians had been granted an exemption to this forced no-entry zone. It wasn't until April 1st, 1949, that Japanese Canadians were granted freedom of movement and re-entered the protective zone along BC's coast. Hong Kong and the Vancouver area. Well, when Hong Kong changed hands from the Brits to the Chinese in 1999, a lot of Hong Kong residents ended up in Vancouver. December 19th, 1984, the People's Republic of China and the United Kingdom signed the Sinai-British Joint Declaration, which validated the 1997 transfer of sovereignty from Hong Kong to China, and that prompted a lot of immigration to the Vancouver area. The British government made it clear that Hong Kong citizens would not be granted British citizenship on grounds that they were residing in the British colony. So instead, make alternative arrangements like pay us, and they migrated to other countries. But there were a lot of Chinese in the Vancouver area. Hong Kong and the Vancouver area, 1989, Tiananmen Square protests and massacre in Beijing triggered mass migrations into the 1990s. Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth realms were the primary destinations for migrants at the time. And that included going to Richmond and the Greater Toronto area. Now, the National Basketball Association put a team in Vancouver because their international data suggested that many people in Hong Kong were interested in the NBA. They're moving to Vancouver, but and they were hoping that the Hong Kongers would embrace the product. That didn't happen. Loonies, July 1989. That was worth about 90, well, rather about 70 cents, and it fluctuates. It's the loonie is worth about 73 cents US these days. To become a citizen in Canada and obtain a passport, immigrants must prove that they have a permanent residence in Canada by purchasing a home or enrolling children in school, and they must pass a citizen test. And that's what happened in the late 1990s. Wealthy investors and entrepreneurs from Hong Kong were given citizenship if they created a job, or they had $350,000 and were willing to help Canada climb out of recession by providing $245,000 into a job-creating investment fund. That is the Lionsgate Bridge. Movie company is named after that. Vancouver is a major film production area. Named after a Vancouver landmark, the Lionsgate Bridge, officially known as the first Narrows Bridge, Lionsgate's Films, as of 2005, written as Lionsgate, is a North American film production and distribution studio that was founded in 1997. And that it is. It's the city of Vancouver. Vancouver has more in common with Seattle than they do with Calgary or Montreal or Toronto. In 2021, Vancouver joined Toronto and Seattle in the top 3, growing at a faster rate than any other North American tech market. Seattle, Vancouver, Victoria, nice places to visit. Any questions, any comments? It's all yours. Yes?
Very good. I went to Vancouver and I wanted to see the Indian totem poles. And when I get there, there's a little placard saying, these are copies. The originals are the American Museum of Natural History in New York City.
Yes.
I'm disappointed.
Yeah, but in Sitka, Alaska, there are some originals. Yes.
When I traveled years ago, mainly
He was
to
excellent.
California on
Enjoy it.
business, the Pacific Ocean never warms up.
Yes.
That's why you have to wear a wetsuit.
Yes.
You jump in there and
You
you
freeze.
Yes.
You freeze. The coldest I've ever been in the summer, coldest I've ever been, there's that point where in San Francisco, in the west part of the town, where the Citro Baths used to be and where Playland used to be, and that wind comes in. It's the coldest place I've ever been in the
I
summer.
was in San Diego,
Yeah,
that famous beach town.
yeah,
You jump in, it's like jumping in ice cube.
Yes.
I lasted 5 minutes.
Yes.
My wife didn't even go in.
yes. Anyway, any other questions or comments before I pack up and go? Yes.
I saw Jimi Hendrix because he played in Fillmore East.
Oh, okay. Which used to be the Yiddish Theater.
That's right.
That used to be the Yiddish Theater.
Absolutely.
Yep.
That's why
Yep.
Thank
Thank you. Thanks.
You want to say your seat?
I haven't done this talk in 3 years, so.
Your seat, I put the paper in my pocket.
Yeah, sure.
little,
Let me just do one thing here.
Say